Hello, everyone. This session is devoted to creating SharePoint 2010 style workflows for SharePoint 2013. And I'm Mike Fitzmaurice. I'm the Vice President of Product Technology for a company called Nintex. We're in the workflow business. If you want to talk about Nintex, we have a booth here. Not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about SharePoint workflow in general. But like Penny, I know something about workflow. I was at Microsoft prior to, I've been at Nintex for about 5 years. Prior to that, I was at Microsoft for 11 years. Most of that time spent on SharePoint. My tenure in SharePoint land predates the word SharePoint. And I was the original technical evangelist for SharePoint back when it required knocking on doors to get people to notice us. Things have changed in a good way. And to my esteemed left is...
My name's Penny Coventry. I'm based in the UK. I've been working with SharePoint now for over 10 years. I'm an independent consultant. I've authored authored or co-authored 10 plus books now. And I'm also a trainer. So that's me.
Fabulous. So the two of us, if you're interested in this topic, you're probably going to hang out with us for 3 sessions. We'll do our level best not to be boring. In fact, we're telling this story in 3 parts. This session is all about, first off, just so you understand the grounding on all of this, all 3 sessions are about 2013. Make no mistake, if you're into the whole 2010 workflow and no-code development story, Jennifer Mason is doing a wonderful series in another room. I'm not really sure where, but Jennifer does good work.
Yeah.
We're talking about 2013. But in order to talk about 2013 and the new way of doing workflows, we need to pause for a moment and do a level set. Because old school workflows still have a place in SharePoint 2013. So you'll still likely build some classic style workflows when the time comes. This session's about that. Then, in the next hour, we're going to cover how to really seize the day and take advantage of the new workflow paradigm. And then in the 3rd session, we will really take the top off of the car and punch it, because we're going to redesign a workflow that was more complicated than it needed to be, taking advantage of new design options in 2013 to do it properly. So properly and optimally and so on and so forth. So there's a demo coming up. We always have demos. But we're going to start with doing some explanations, beginning with this. This is the information worker track. So I need to spend some time explaining the tiniest bit of architecture, but not a lot. Again, this is the IW track. If it was the IT Pro track or the Dev track, it would be a different story. But what we want to say is that SharePoint has 2 workflow engines, and you really do need to know that much. One is known as, actually almost no one calls it this, but it really is its name. It's the SharePoint workflow host. It's the part of SharePoint that ran classic workflows, if you would, or the 2010 model or 2010 workflows. Tell you what the difference is in just a second. The other one is known as the Workflow Manager. This is new. In fact, for a while during the beta period, it was called the Azure Workflow Host. Bad name, because it had nothing to do with Azure. If you want to, you can refer to this as new model workflows or 2013 workflows, but it's the Workflow Manager. And we'll probably call them, for the most part, for the next 3 sessions, 2010 workflows and 2013 workflows, but all this is happening in SharePoint 2013. Now to compare the two, Workflow 3.5, classic workflows run inside of SharePoint. There's no workflow engine that's separate from SharePoint itself. SharePoint timer jobs and SharePoint's routines that fire as something gets updated or created. We'll just call some code libraries and run them. There's no separate process for running workflows. and it's based on Windows Workflow Foundation 3.5. The new Workflow Manager is a completely separate process. It's a separate service. Ideally, it runs on a separate machine. And it's based around Windows Workflow Foundation 4.5, which was a complete rewrite of Microsoft's workflow platform. The main thing to keep in mind is old school workflows run as a native part of SharePoint, and new school workflows run on a separate box someplace that is trusted with and interacts with SharePoint. Now, there are issues that 2013 addressed, otherwise we'd still be using the 2010 style workflow engine for everything. Now, in 2010, the focus was really on on-premise workflows. The engine is fine for that purpose, but it really wasn't designed to go beyond on-premise. Every time you customize it or extend it, it requires code that is going to be fully trusted by SharePoint. There are a couple exceptions to this, but they weren't very practical or useful. So for all practical purposes, extending workflow involved writing stuff that had better be trustworthy. The scale was limited. Actually, you could scale it rather nicely, but if you wanted to increase SharePoint's workflow capacity, there were some tweaks you could make on server configurations, but if you really needed to make a quantum leap forward, you'd add a whole new web front-end machine, which if you only needed to increase your workflow throughput was probably overkill. You probably needed an extra web front end anyway to make page loads faster, but still. And the robustness had limits. It worked, make no mistake, it worked, but if you weren't conscious of its behavior, you might write something to a list and then attempt to read it immediately thereafter without waiting to make sure it got written, that the update got committed. All kinds of little nuances were there. SharePoint Designer also, as a tool, also had a lot of limits, but that's the fault of the tool, not the platform. In 2013, there's no real fundamental difference between the way workflow behaves in the cloud and the way workflow behaves on-premise. The engine was designed to scale to the cloud very, very nicely. It's based on App Fabric technology, which is an abstraction layer above both Windows Server and above Windows Azure, or Azure, as you guys say Azure, right? Okay, sorry about that. It interacts with SharePoint, talks to it, but it uses industry standard protocols like REST, and it handles permissions properly. The workflow is outside of SharePoint, but it is explicitly granted permissions using OAuth to identify itself to SharePoint and gain certain privileges. And it talks over standard APIs. Sometimes it skips past going directly to REST and uses the C# object model. You don't have to care about that. What you do have to care about is it's outside SharePoint, it talks to SharePoint in the most responsible, standardized way imaginable. It's a good thing. And it scales nicely. If you're talking about running SharePoint in the cloud, in Office 365 or something else, it's in a magic abstracted service out there that will just scale out or up as it needs to be, and you don't have to notice or care. If you're talking, however, about, how can I best put this, on-premise, well, you can add extra workflow process machines anytime you want. Just more and more and more. Even if you have only one web front end, but you're doing a whole bunch of business process automation, great. Do that, you'll have a nice life. You can add workflow handlers without manipulating SharePoint itself. Or if you only do a little bit of workflow, you can still have 3 web front ends and 1 workflow processor. Not a big deal. It is a separate install, but it's worth it.
And it could be installed on your SharePoint servers.
Yeah, it's true. You can install it on your SharePoint service. If it's a small enough deployment, Microsoft really recommends you install it on a separate box, but I've done it, you've done it, customers have done it, and no one has gotten hurt so far from running it on the same hardware. So, the big question is, and the reason we have this session, why use 2010 workflows at all? There are 4 reasons. It turns out they're actually pretty good reasons. Reason number 1, you're upgrading. Windows Workflow Foundation 3.5 is completely incompatible with Windows Workflow Foundation 4.0, and 4.5 builds on 4.0. Microsoft decided to just start over, clean slate, redo the workflow paradigm completely. There's absolutely no guarantee. There's not even a hint or a nod and a wink of being able to upgrade a 3.5 workflow to a 4.anything workflow. And as such, I recommend you do not try. There is no upgrade or conversion option. There just plain isn't. So if you need to move workflows forward into 2013 and you're staying on premise, keep running those workflows exactly as is. They will upgrade, but they're going to upgrade and stay old school. It's not a bad thing. Second thing is, if you understand and know and have made your peace with the way workflow worked in 2010, it does work. We actually know how everything has quirks. We know the quirks of the 2010 style workflow environment. The 2013 style workflow environment, we're still discovering all the crazy nuances that can only be found from collecting and distilling a lot of observations made in production by many, 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 many customers. It's not to say it's not ultimately better. I think by the time the smoke clears and after it goes through a revision or 2 or a few people make extensions to it, it's going to be far, far superior. But right now, it's the Wild West. It's a good Wild West, as was the West. But it's still, there is uncertainty. And if you don't like uncertainty, go with the devil you know. The other thing is, you get it automatically. There's no extra installation required. It is a painless thing to do. Related to that is reason number 3. If you have SharePoint Foundation, it's your only option. You cannot use Workflow Manager in SharePoint Foundation only. The reason being is SharePoint, the Workflow Manager figures out who a user is and properties about that user, not by talking to Active Directory, but by talking to the SharePoint User Profile Store. The reason is this was designed to run in the cloud. There might not be an Active Directory out there. And it'll run on-premise happily, but also, again, if you're talking to SharePoint, you might be using claims-based authentication with a different claims provider than Active Directory, or you might be using forms-based authentication or something like that. Since there's no guarantee there's an Active Directory there, and since the individual list of users inside any given SharePoint site is not enough information to establish trust or impersonate or do anything like that, the only place to go is somewhere that's robust. That's the User Profile Store. User Profile Store is a SharePoint server-only feature. So QED, your host if you're using SharePoint Foundation. You have to stick with old school workflows. And finally, you might want work features that they didn't implement in the 2013 paradigm. Turns out it's a pretty long list. And to Microsoft's defense, I will say that their focus was on evolving the platform to something new. They could always add features after the fact. They could always rely on partners to provide the features that they don't do in the box. There are many other things. They focused on the stuff that only Microsoft could do, but a lot of stuff got left by the wayside. It's not that they took it away, it's that they didn't duplicate it in the new order, which is why one of the reasons why the old order is still there for you to use. So here's an example. Anyone use the Task Process Designer in SharePoint 2010 when designing workflows? It's not there in 2013. I'm sorry. Don't worry, we're going to give you hope in the next hour. But the ability to start a custom approval process or a custom feedback process or a custom task process where you could build your own task, figure out what a collection of participants were and so on. You could modify those in SharePoint Designer. In fact, the default out-of-the-box workflows were these things, and they could be customized in real time. They acted as sub-processes, so the workflow could stop, gather approvals, gather input, yada, yada, yada. Eventually come back, the workflow continues. They were like sub-processes. Now, admittedly, that also was a SharePoint Server only thing, but lots of people had SharePoint Server. General purpose task actions, like assigning a form to a group, or assigning a to-do item, or collecting data from a user. There was more than one kind of task in the 2010 engine. It's still there, so they're still there. In 2013, there's really just one kind of task. More on that next hour, but if you want to use several different kinds of tasks, that's what 2010 is still good for. And there were a lot of higher order activities like document set manipulations. You could capture a version, you could set the content approval status, you could start an approval process on a document set, all kinds of fun things. You could manipulate permissions on list and library content. You could visualize the process flow of the workflow using Visio services. Yes, you can't do that in 2013. If you want to be able to show users a visual path, you're going to want to go and use a 2010 style workflow. And there are all other miscellaneous things, like being able to do a reusable workflow on a content type. They just didn't have time to implement that. So a reusable workflow on a list item or a document library, no problem. You want to do if you care about content types, you can't do workflows on content types in the new engine. Have to stick with the old engine for that. Who likes content types? Good, you should. I like content types too. They're working on it. It just won't be ready right away or even soon. Templates. Looking up who a user's manager is, declaring something as a record or undeclaring it, setting the content approval status, waiting for something to change, checking if there is if value equals value in 2013, but if you want to see if a field in the current item equals something or compare it to something, that condition's not present. Being able to impersonate the designer of the workflow is not possible. If you want to be able to do that, you stick with the old engine. Let me explain. The paradigm shift is different. The impersonation in 2013 is, I either run as the intersection of this app, my workflow, and the user who started it, the initiator, together, and I have the sum of their privileges. They can be, in other words, the privileges of the app restricted by the privileges of the user. You don't add them together, you look for the intersection, and that's what you're allowed to do. In 2013, you can take away the restrictions based on the user and let the app do whatever the app has been allowed to do. So it's either restricted by the user or the app is God. One of the two, and you can decide site by site whether or not to allow that. In 2010, you actually have no God option, but you do have the option to say, well, the designer of the workflow had this much privileges, so their workflow went during a step where they impersonate or elevate, then they're operating with the privileges of the designer. And if they're outside of that step, it's still the privileges of the initiator. If you want that kind of permission control, stick with 2010 workflows. And they still scale pretty well, and they're still fairly robust. Again, we've learned a lot about them. They aren't bad. I like the new engine better, but the 2010 engine still has a place. And finally, InfoPath support. Anyone use InfoPath? Wow, a lot of you. Okay, well, that's a big reason to stick with the 2010 engine as well. That said, there is hope. Penny is going to show you that 2010 workflows can do real work. There are a lot of people out there that are saying the new engine is finally ready for prime time, can finally do real work. The 2010 engine is actually pretty good. And here comes proof.
Right, so I'm going to demo creating SharePoint 2010 workflows in SharePoint 2013, just to show you can still do it. As Mike said, this is a three-part presentation, and we're going to take a SharePoint 2010 workflow and say, how would we do it different if we built it as a SharePoint 2013 workflow? So I'm going to introduce you to the scenario that we're going to be using and converting over to SharePoint 2013. Now, how many people came to last year's session? Okay, so we did a change request scenario last year, and we built it all in SharePoint 2010. So I'm going to review that SharePoint 2010 workflow that we created at last year's conference, and that's the process that we're going to take and move over to a 2013. So you'll see how we had to implement it in 2010 and the limitations we had to get over, and then we're going to, during the 3 sessions, particularly the last one, we're going to look at how we would do it in 2013. Now, the scenario will be very familiar to most of you. It's a change request process. And so, yes, what will happen is that you, if you're in the IT department, might need to raise a change in your IT infrastructure. You might need to put a new server in to put the workflow manager on, for example. And so you will need to fill in a form, and you will need to submit it to get it approved. And most organisations will have 2 sets of approval. They'll have a technical review, so your change will be checked by a peer who knows the technology and makes sure that there's no knock-on effects. And then once they have okayed it, it will then be put to the change control board. And then they'll have to say, yes, we don't mind if you're going to be out all weekend or something like that. And then, okay, when both those bodies have approved the change request, you'll be able to implement that change request. So that's what we're going to do. But of course, any change request process isn't like that. It's not serial, bam, 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 yes, okay, out you go and implement it. Usually it's really hard to get a change request approved. You know, what tends to happen is that the IT support, as I say, or somebody raises the change request, the technical reviewer reviews it, but he wants some more information. You haven't been specific enough about what you're actually going to do. You were trying to hide something, weren't you? We've all been there, yes? But he's sussed us out, and so he says, right, I need some more information. So it goes back to the person who raised the change request. Then he resubmits it. The IT technical reviewer then reviews it again. He perhaps has to go through that cycle many times. I always tell them that we have got a phone that we might help speed things up instead of letting the process keep on going round and round and round. But finally, the technical reviewer says, yes, that's okay, but it gets as far as the change request board and they reject it, okay? They need some extra information. And before you know it, the date that you actually wanted to implement this change has gone by, okay? Yes, we've all been there, nods around, yeah. So this is what we're going to be trying to automate to help that situation. So we are going to need some kind of looping mechanism so that we can go round certain parts of the process again and again. And now, unfortunately, SharePoint 2010 didn't allow us to do that. I explained at last year's conference that I had to, in fact, implement it as 2 workflows, right? One was the main workflow that said, right, okay, yes, you're going to approve it. Yes, that's lovely. So it would pass from one reviewer to another and everything would be okay. But to take into account the loops about requiring additional feedback, and if, like the change request board might consider additional feedback, well, perhaps when that additional feedback was given, we shouldn't just go back in at the change, the CCB stage, but we really should pop back in so that the technical reviewer can actually see the additional new information, because that might affect his decision as well. So we had to implement it last time as 2 workflows, the primary workflow and the secondary workflow that dealt with the review process. So that's what I'm going to be looking at today. So the first thing would be to gather your business requirements using Visio. Now, none of this has changed whether you're collecting or whether you're going to create a SharePoint 2010 or a SharePoint 2013 workflow. You can still use Visio to collect your business requirements, and you can still import that Visio diagram into SharePoint Designer and add the additional things. Okay. We'll talk about the enhancements at the next presentation. So here's my workflow. And so it says, so I've got a document library. It could be a form library if your change request was an info path form, but or it could be an ordinary list, you know, if you're gathering your requirements as columns in a list. So I'm going to associate this workflow with a document library, and I'm going to have additional columns in my document library that enable me to work out the status that the change request is in. So the very first status is the change request in a pending status? You know, have we just uploaded the document? Have we just created that change request? If that's the case, then we do want to go ahead through our process. So this is the main process. I'll deal with the secondary process later on, perhaps in the third session. We say, yes, it is a CR pending status. I also so what I'm also going to say in this session about some good practices, and these good practices, it doesn't matter whether you're using SharePoint 2010 workflows or whether you're going to be creating SharePoint 2013 workflows. The philosophy is still the same in both of them. Okay, so there's no need in a lot of cases to relearn everything just because you're going to be creating a 2013 one. So the limitation with both types of workflows is that there's still no good debugging mechanism for SharePoint Designer. Okay, so the best way of working out exactly what's happening underneath the covers and whether you did actually calculate the right value or whether you did pick up the right value from a list or a library is to write away to the workflow history log. Okay. Now, the capacity of lists and libraries are a lot better in 2013, but the recommendation from Microsoft is that whenever you create a new workflow, you should create a new task list and you should create a new workflow history list. Okay, because they're going to be very inundated with items of information about your workflow. So keep them separate from your day-to-day task list. Okay. So I always write a lot to the history list, and not only for debugging purposes for myself, but it also helps the person understand what sort of stage is happening. You know, did the email get sent? Did the person approve it? Okay, so it's a nice feedback to the person's document as to actually what's happening. It also helps the help desk. Okay, as they open up the workflow status and somebody says, okay, this workflow's gone wrong, they can actually look and see what you've written away. Because the thing is, you don't want to be called in for every time that somebody doesn't use the workflow correctly or wants a query about it. So you do want to try and delegate that. If you keep all the knowledge to yourself, you're not really should be using SharePoint, should you? Okay, you should be sharing by default. So right away to that history log. So if the change request, the document is in a change request pending status, then we're going to start the approval process. So we're going to use this super duper subtask, which I really, really love in SharePoint 2010. We can still use it in SharePoint 2013. And so that will start the out-of-the-box approval process that you will be very familiar with if you've associated one of the out-of-the-box hyphen SharePoint 2010 workflow templates with your document library. So I'm going to be calling that, and I'm going to be putting into it the people who should be reviewing the technical request. Now, the one I'm going to be showing you out of the box it has got hard-coded in names, but we could actually get the names of the technical reviewers from a list. You know, we could check what sort of area the change request is in. Is it desktop? Is it server? And then according to the type of change request, we could then in our workflow pick up who we need to send the change request to. And we can do that. If it's approved, then we're going to change the status of the workflow to TR status approved. Okay, so that column where we're maintaining the status of the workflow not of the workflow, but of the change request, we will update that column so that people can have a look at it. Why I've said not the column that's associated with the workflow is because underneath the cover, the engine updates that column. So we've got this separate column that is a way of us maintaining the status or the stages of the workflow. Okay, so once that's approved, then again we go through the same thing. If it's not approved, then there's going to be research needed. Now what you can do with the start approval process is out of the box you get accept, rejected, change request and pass on to somebody else and cancel. I think there's 5 buttons out of the box. Now using the start approval process we can add a new button to that task form when it comes up, and it's quite easy to add. In SharePoint Designer, we open up the Start Approval Process settings page, and down in the right-hand column area, it says, here are the buttons, do you want a new button? Okay, and yes, we do want a new button so that people can click, yes, I need feedback. Okay, so we can then pop out of that Start Approval process, and that's when we change the column again that says what is the status of this, and we change it to another value, and that value, the research needed, is the trigger for this secondary workflow. So when that column changes, so we've configured the secondary workflow to say, right, yes, kick off when an item changes, it looks at the column, and if it says feedback needed, then it kicks off that secondary workflow. So that's the idea of it. So let's go and have a look to see what it looks like. I'm going to sit down because you're more interested in this, aren't you? All right. So here is the, I've opened up SharePoint Designer already. I've also got open the document library, and I have I have got several documents already working in it. So if I have a look, so if I started a workflow, so as you can see it is 2013 because we've got the nice UI. So I can start a workflow on here. So I can use my change request workflow that I've built in SharePoint Designer. There's the initiation screen. So it all looks like SharePoint 2010 at the moment because it is a 2010 workflow. So even though my site is a 2013 workflow, I am running inside of SharePoint this SharePoint 2010 workflow. Okay. I should have been clicking and clicking refresh as Mike talked. The machine went to sleep. I'll come back and show you that. So here is SharePoint Designer. Here is the request process. You can see it's quite busy. It's not too long. And as I recommended last year, is that you use your steps as a way of documenting your workflow and dividing off your workflow into logical components. Now, I always tend to start all my workflows with a section that says initializing variables. When you first of all start a workflow, so let me go back here. So say, for example, I start a list workflow on the document library. In SharePoint 2013, you can see here we've got an extra box now that says what sort of workflow do you want to create? Do you want to create a SharePoint 2010 workflow, or do you want to create a SharePoint 2013 workflow? So that's the way we decide which of the two types of workflows we're going to create. Well, I'm going to create a 2010 workflow. And up it opens, so everything looks like 2010. Okay. Now, if we were looking at the variables at the moment, there are no variables. Okay. Now, say I'm going to install this start approval process. So down in the task section, we've got the start approval process. Okay. So I've added that section. If we now look at the local variables, you can see now, for free, we've got loads and loads of variables. And every time you add one of those start approval process, you'll get another set of variables. So the variables to do with the second start approval process. We can include that as many times as we want. But of course, we can't have the same variable names, so they'll tag on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 after it. Now, of course, you can see there, but just by scrolling down, we've got loads and loads of variables. You're then going to start including all your own variables. Okay? So I always recommend that you always have a naming standard for your own variables, and hopefully choose a letter, because you can see there in, well, this particular dialog box doesn't show them in alphabetical order, but some of the other dialog box you come up with SharePoint does show your variables in alphabetical order. So it's always a good idea to start your variables with A or something like that. So your variables are always at the top. Because it's not very often that you're going to need these variables that get included when you include the start approval process. You will want to know about some of them. So some of the ones that you will want to know about is, for example, the is item approved variable. So outside of the start approval sub-process, we don't have to actually amend it to actually find out what's going on. When we get control back in our own part of the workflow, we can use that variable to work out what's happened in the start approval sub-process. So that's one of the things I always do. So I always initialize my variables. You just need to be a little bit careful about where you initialize your variables, because remember, these workflows are going on for a long time. Okay? So if you're picking off information from your lists and libraries, then by the time you've actually reached that part of the workflow, it might be in 2 months' time or whatever, which means if you're picking up the email address of the person who's supposed to approve the desktop change requests, well, they may have moved on, but somebody has kept that list up to date. So when you actually need to pick it off just before you need to use it. Don't just initialize it at the start of your workflow and then use that the value in that variable. It's always a good idea to have stuff in variables instead of having to continually ask SharePoint to go away to a list or a library to pick up that information, because it does mean that your workflow is going to have to do, or SharePoint is going to have to do more work. It's going to have to put the workflow in a suspended state while it goes away to the database, to the disk, to actually pull off that information. So if you are using something an awful lot, then it is good to actually load it into a variable and then use the contents of that variable. So here is initialize my variables. The next stage here is going to test to see if the column is in a CR pending status. So if I go back to my workflow now, oh, it's added it, it's started the workflow and it's completed it, and it's all because I didn't set the status of that CR status column to CR pending. So if I change that to CR pending, and then we can save it. Oh. Oh yes, because I changed it, I've set the trigger to actually start the workflow when I changed it, so I didn't have to manually start it. So yes, as Mike says, in SharePoint 2010 workflows, we still can have, if we choose to have it, the Visio representation of that workflow. So that would be the bit that was missing if I created a SharePoint 2013 workflow. So the workflow has started and we've got a task assigned to a particular person. So up comes the task form. And as I said, I've added an extra button there on that form. And this form is an info path form. Again, this is one of the, although you can have a task form in SharePoint 2013, it will not be presented as an info path form. It will be a plain ASPX page, page. So that's what Mike meant there, that you're not going to get any info path forms with your SharePoint 2013 workflows. So that's the extra button, but I've still got these other buttons that you're used to seeing on the out-of-the-box approval process. So this is the approval process that I've put in here. If it is not in a pending status, I'm going to stop the workflow. And I often do that because I often get rid of items right at the beginning of my workflow, because it does actually make your workflow very much readable. If you didn't do that, so if I did put a condition there that said if CR status is pending, right, and then I put all the logic within the if, you get very much a if nested a workflow, which makes it a lot more unreadable. So I always use the logic about get rid of items that I don't need to process early on in my workflow. It also means if later on I need to use the impersonation step in SharePoint 2010, well, the impersonation step cannot be nested in another step. It always has to be an outer step. Okay? So that's another reason to try to keep nested ifs to a minimum. Okay? So do your logic so that you can get rid of stuff. And again, I write away to the log. So now we've got a technical review, and this is the start approval process. Over here in the task outcomes, you can see this is where I created the button. That's all I had to do was to click the new, which creates the button for me. Okay? I don't have to go into InfoPath to actually design the form and put the button there for me. So that's all done for me. Now these approval processes are very complicated. And I would recommend that you don't change them without doing a lot of research and playing around with yourself. They're actually divided into 3 parts. So you've got the ability to amend what happens at a single task level. Remember, the start approval process creates a task item for everybody who's part of that task process. So I clicked on it in the browser and it opened up a task form, which I could then accept or reject. And so I can decide what to do on an individual task item instance. And if I click on this, now this is very much different from the workflows you get out of the box in SharePoint 2010. In 2010, if I go back and I open up the same workflow in a different window so that we can have a look at both of them at the same time. Okay, so there it is, and I talk about having steps. And I rename my steps to be meaningful description about what I'm trying to do in that step. Okay, and when the workflow engine comes to the bottom of this step, it drops through and starts executing the actions in the next step. And then when it comes to the last one in this step, it drops through to the actions in the next step. When I have a look at the start approval process and I'm looking at the control or the sets of actions that I want to actually manipulate on a per task basis, it looks as if I've got steps, all right? And again, there's some nice, meaningful descriptions. But this is not the same sort of behavior. When the workflow engine gets to the bottom and executes the last action in this box, okay, it doesn't automatically drop through to the next box. Because what we've got here is a state workflow, okay? And we're going to talk more about this in the 3rd session, okay? But so in SharePoint 2010, we can have state workflows. Okay? And you may have heard from many people that you can only create them using Visual Studio. Yes, in SharePoint Designer, you cannot create a state workflow, but here you have a state workflow. So the engine is trying to work out which of these boxes to execute according to the state of the task item. So if the task item is in a pending state, right, then it will execute these actions. If you have changed the task item and you've deleted it, then it will execute these commands as part of the deletion process. If you've changed the task item and said, yes, I have completed the task, right, then it will execute these things. So this is a different representation, a different type of workflow. This is a state workflow. Okay? And so we could amend this. As I say, I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you really knew it. We can also work out what happens when the task actually changes. Okay. So every time you complete a task item, it comes in and does this check. It says, are there any more tasks to be assigned to anyone? Right? So it works out how many tasks it should have actually executed. Okay? And it works out if there are any new tasks to be done. If all the tasks have been completed, then it will work out whether to set the isApproval variable that we saw to yes or no. Okay? So that's how it works it out. We've got another section of this process which says what is the overall behaviour of the task. Right? So when all the tasks have been completed, right, then can we do some other things? So again, it'll say, right, what should we do before any task is created? So this is again a state workflow. Okay? And on it goes. And we can change things in here. So we can say, right, we have put 3 people in the approval process, and out of the box, all 3 people have to approve it before the item is approved. Now, in some cases, that's not the business process you want. You only care if 2 people out of the 3 approve it. So here, within this start approval sub-process, we can alter that. We can actually say, right, we'll say, yes, it's approved if 3 people have approved it out of 4. So 75% of the people have approved it. Now, again, you have to dig in and work out exactly whereabout in these 3 links that I've clicked, exactly where to change that. And if the first 3 people approve it, then this sub-process will complete if you change it in the right place. Okay? As I say, there is a little bit of danger of doing that, because if you play around with this too much, you can break this sub-process. Okay? I talk from experience. Okay? So this is the sub-process here. So going back, you can say approve or reject. And then, of course, just like any approval process, it will kick the next person in the process. You get this Visio representation. There are some limitations about this Visio representation, in that the fact you get a tick if somebody has completed their task. Right? It doesn't mean that they've accepted it, approved it, okay? Because if they've rejected it, you'll also get a tick, because they have completed their task. So I do get many people who say that they don't like the Visio representation, because if the users look at it, then it does misrepresent the actual process that's going on. So a lot of them in SharePoint Designer will clear the checkbox that says, please generate a Visio representation. You also don't have any control of that Visio representation. SharePoint Designer generates this Visio representation for you. You can't open Visio and import your own representation. Okay? If you did, it would still get overwritten the next time you publish the SharePoint 2010 workflows. So again, that's a limitation. Also, as you can see, in a long workflow, it gets very long, okay? And you can see my workflow wasn't very long. It is quite a complex workflow, but you can see by actually dividing things in stages, it can be very readable. But the stages don't show up in the Visio representation. If you export your Visio diagram into Visio, there is no such shape as stage in Visio, okay? So I often find that, yes, I do use Visio to collect my business requirements, but I do jiggery-pokery and I do move actions around so that I can logically put them all together in steps so it's readable from my point of view and I can maintain it, okay? But as I say, those stages don't come up in your Visio representation. So that's the workflow, and we will be taking this workflow a little bit further, and we will be changing it into a 2013 workflow in future sessions. So that's my demo completed.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Penny. And let's try that one more time. Nope. Shall we try for a
well,
third attempt?
Last slide is questions and answers.
That's
okay?
true.
So we don't really have to show it to you.
I suppose not, but we do have valuable information.
Oh, yes, we do, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
So, but
we
before we
got
go
out?
any
Yeah.
further, let's take questions. We have a few minutes for expressly this purpose.
My question is about obviously one of my initial questions was how on earth are you going to use 2010 workflow engine in a 2013 environment? But you've answered that already in the SharePoint design. But are there any actual limitations with using the 2010 engine in 2013, or is it a matter of just find out and see how it goes? Will it work?
It is exactly the same as 2010. Okay, so there's no difference.
So I guess you're going to go over why you should choose 2013 and 2010 next.
Yes, yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Well, the next session is laced, it's got completely different demos and it's laced with nuance. So here we just said 2010 workflows still have a place. Next time we'll tell you 2013 workflows are awesome. Use them. And yeah, we don't want to paint a bleak picture. I guess the main theme of this 3-session series is you're going to use both. Realistically speaking, unless you're running completely out of Office. Anyone Office 365 and nothing else?
Even there, in Office 365, you can have SharePoint 2010 workflows.
You can, can't you?
Yeah,
Yes.
so no
you
difference.
Can't really extend it, but you can do the baseline stuff. Yeah, that's true. So realistically speaking, you're likely to be using both for some time.
And hopefully you've seen that your skills you've used in 2010 are exactly the same sorts of skills you're going to be using if you're going to build a 2013. You're still going to have variables, okay? There's still things called steps and stages in 2013.
All right, that's true, especially if the way it works in Visio has changed considerably from 2010 to 2013 if you're using Visio Interop, but if you're using the outline style designer present in SharePoint Designer, which is free. Visio costs something in order to get that. The UI is completely familiar. It's an effortless transition path from using SharePoint Designer for 2010 and
so you
SharePoint
can still
Designer.
type in and the actions will appear. And
Look and feel. There's no learning curve other than, oh wait, where's that action? It's not there, that kind of thing.
If you're in 2013.
Correct.
Yeah. And you've got a few extra buttons on the ribbon, so we'll be talking about those.
Any other questions?
I think somebody over there had their hand up.
So the migration from SharePoint 2010 is completely transparent in terms of workflows.
Yes. It depends how you've
What
migrated.
was the
Oh,
question?
yes. So you're saying that when you're migrating over your 2010 environment and you have got workflows built in your 2010 environment, are they still going to be working in 2010 and is it going to be transparent to you?
Will it be editable or completely compatible? So will it just I can keep maintaining the same environment?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
your question was, is it still going to be editable? Are they going to still be compiled? Do I need to go in there and recompile them? All those sorts of questions. Okay.
The answer to that question has nuance of its own. So the answer is your workflow models are completely fine. They'll work just fine. I think the question you might have, the question behind the question, workflows that are still running pre-upgrade, or instances of workflows that are running, will they continue to run, or will the upgrade break them? Is that your question?
Yes, and but I can still update them, sort of edit them.
You can edit them afterwards, right. Okay, so let's talk about there's workflow definitions and workflow instances. The definition is the thing you edit in SharePoint Designer or Visio or whatever, or Visual Studio or whatever. The instance is running that definition on a specific site or list item or document or something like that. And you could have several instances of the same workflow definition running at the time. So two things are important when upgrading. Part number one is my workflow definitions. Are they no longer legal? Will there be any mismatches or anything like that? So if I start a new instance post-upgrade, will it work? Or do I have to open it, publish it, and then keep going? Part two is these instances that I had running when I started my upgrade, when the upgrade finishes, what will happen to those running instances of the workflow? All right, now, let's answer these questions one at a time. The answer to the first question is much happier. The question there for the second, or the answer to the second question is it depends. The first question, no, it's totally compatible. You're fine.
So
I will say
any
this.
triggers will work.
Yeah.
The new instances of the workflow will be fired off. You don't have to do any pre-compilation. They'll be editable in SharePoint Designer.
Mm-hmm. What she said. There is one thing to watch out for. If you are using Active Directory style authentication in 2010, when you migrate to 2013, you're going to want to use claims going forward. They are superior, and they're the mechanism by which software talks to each other in a trusted, responsible way. You don't have to move to them, but several things won't work if you don't. My advice, not as a representative of any company, but my advice, before you perform the migration from 2010 to 2013, there is a claims authentication migrator for 2010 to 2010. Make sure that all the identities get migrated over to claims properly, sort that, and once that's done, then migrate over to 2013. If you don't do that, and something is confusing post-migration, you won't know if it's because the identities have all shifted or because the software has shifted. So I do think being mindful of the shift to claims is worth the extra time. But there are mechanisms inside of Microsoft's conversion tools and inside of the workflow host that should translate between the old identity and the new identity as the workflow runs. It's supposed to work, but just to be safe, I'd do the claims migration first and then the software migration. But work with someone that understands SharePoint well, takes a look at your environment, make some informed decisions on that. That's the advice I would give. But I'm fond of doing the claims migration first and then the software migration. Now, you're running instances. Depends on how you're going to do a migration. You can't do an in-place upgrade. That was possible from 2007 to 2010, but from 2010 to 2013, you cannot do an in-place upgrade. You can do a database migration. And if you do a database migration, your running workflow instances will come through just fine. If you try to migrate one site collection at a time in a piecemeal fashion, forget it. It's not going to work. If you use a third-party migration tool that does a more little bit at a time style migration, none of them can migrate current workflow state. They might claim they can, but I suspect the salesperson doesn't understand the problem. Workflow state is persisted as a blob inside of SharePoint's. It's not even persisted as a blob in raw SharePoint, it's persisted in a blob by the Windows Workflow Foundation components and then stored in SharePoint. So it's really, really, really hard and not at all documented to the rest of us. So if they've tried proprietary techniques to crack that, great. I have not seen anyone successfully do it yet. And if someone has, wonderful. It would just be news. So if you can migrate the whole content database at once, you're going to have a happy time. Any other questions? Yes.
You briefly mentioned scalability. One of the issues that I've experienced with 10 is workflows pausing for 5 minutes because it claims there's heavy load on the environment.
Mhm.
Is that still a problem with 330?
It handles it in a completely different way. You could have pauses, but
So is your question on your SharePoint 2010 workflows or on your SharePoint 2013 workflows?
oh, good point. Very good point. Thank you, Penny. Things won't change in the 2010 workflows running in 2013 at all. The 2013 workflows running in 2013 are again, those are published. A copy's kept in SharePoint, but the master copy's kept in SharePoint itself, but the working copy is kept over on that external service. And so if there are too many workflows running, it'll throttle that or handle it. It has its own mechanisms for doing that. You still might run into a pause, but it's not as likely to happen. The queuing mechanism is a bit more efficient. But again, every call it needs to go back into SharePoint to do something is a remote call. So it could get weird too. Yes?
No, what we're saying is that when you create a workflow in SharePoint 2010, if you've used one of the start tasks actions, or if you've said you're using a reusable workflow, or if you've said yes, manually start a workflow, then a SharePoint designer talking to SharePoint will create the initiation form, the association form, and all the task forms as info path forms. Okay? Whereas in SharePoint 2010, any task forms, initiation forms, or association forms, if you create a SharePoint 2013 workflow, will be created as ASPX pages. So if you had one, if you were used to in SharePoint 2010 amending any of those forms by using InfoPath, well, if you want to amend those forms in a SharePoint 2013 workflow, you need to start learning ASP.
Indeed. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
In the next version of SharePoint after 2013, are you still going to support
Oh, if we knew, we couldn't tell you. Yes.
It's more, what in your experience would you do if you've got a customer who wants this action and you've got 2013 and 2010 workflows to choose from? Would you always go 2013 as your starting point so that you can?
If you don't need okay, first off, if you're using Office 365 or SharePoint Server, then the 2013 engine is available to you. If you don't need functionality that wasn't implemented in 2013, then you you're willing to look at tasks a different way, then yeah, of course, do it in 2013.
They'll scale better. So
Yeah.
workflows tend to be in organisations, it tends to be sort of not the immediate thing that they start using. And then it starts to trickle feed. And if you are going to use them a lot and you are going to put pressure on the workflow engine, then the 2013 workflow engine is much, much better for scaling out and being stressed out.
Yes, it's a nice engine. The thing is, they didn't do everything, and therefore, relying on the old engine for some things during the 2013 life cycle is not a bad or irresponsible decision some of the time. That's our thesis statement for IW401. Now, related sessions to come. We have one in the next, coming up shortly, that'll all be about 2013 style workflows. And then 403 will be focusing on redoing this task process workflow the 2013 way, which is no disrespect, a lot more fun. And then, let's see, what are some other fun ones? Dev 204, if you want to see how to do these workflows in Visual Studio, Andrew Connell will hook you up. And then Fabian Williams has a business process re-engineering example in the community track. Let's see, we already mentioned Jennifer Mason's 4-part series, although that's all based on SharePoint 2010.
But you could create that in SharePoint 2013.
You could. You could do it in 2013, but it's all based on 2010 style workflow technology. It's the old workflow engine and it involves info platforms. But the way she goes about designing the solution and building it gradually is actually kind of fun. However, I would say hang out with us. We're doing the new stuff. And then, look, there are other things, and think of this as a record of what is to come, but there are some good
Yeah.
good items
So if
here.
you're an IT pro, then that business continuity management one might be of interest to you. Or at least these are ones that you could say, right, on the CD when I get back and I'm really into workflow, then that's some of the indications we thought would be useful. We've not seen them either, but they look good.
Yep. All right, plenty of useful links out there, and of course, one of the most useful resource materials will be the conference DVDs each and every one of you gets once the smoke from the show clears. And with that, thank you very much for attending. Appreciate
So I
it.
think you've got about 10 minutes now.